Hello everyone, I'm your storyteller. I know you're watching this to unwind and drift off to sleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And also, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there? Let's allow the darkness to take over and set the mood. Now, flip your phone upside down, leave all your worries behind, and make yourself comfortable. Relax, and let's get started. I still remember that evening like it was yesterday. It was one of those days where the world felt heavy, the kind of day that weighs on your shoulders and refuses to let go. So, I decided to take a quiet escape into the forest near my home. It had always been my refuge, a place where time seemed to pause and the air itself felt alive. The moment I stepped into the forest, a hush fell over me, like entering a sacred sanctuary. The sounds of the world behind me faded into a soft blur. All I could hear now was the whisper of the leaves above, swaying gently in the breeze. It wasn't just a sound, it was a language, ancient and soothing, as if the trees were welcoming me, urging me to leave my worries behind. The path was soft underfoot, carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched faintly as I walked. The earthy smell of pine and damp soil filled my lungs, grounding me in the moment. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the canopy, dappling the ground with golden patches that danced as the leaves moved. The forest felt alive, not just with sound, but with something deeper, something I couldn't quite explain. I walked slowly, letting my fingers graze the bark of the trees as I passed. Their textures were rough, yet comforting, like shaking hands with an old friend. Occasionally, a stronger gust of wind would come through, and the trees would sway just slightly more, their leaves brushing against each other like a chorus of whispers. Then I heard something faint, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that didn't belong to nature. It sounded like a soft hum, almost melodic, and it seemed to be coming from deeper within the forest. My heart quickened, not with fear, but with curiosity. "Is someone there?" I asked aloud, my voice breaking the tranquil silence. The forest didn't answer, of course, but the hum grew a little louder, almost playful, as if beckoning me to follow. I hesitated for a moment. This forest was vast, and though I knew it well, there were corners I hadn't ventured into. But something about that sound was impossible to resist. It wasn't threatening, if anything. It felt like an invitation, a promise of something extraordinary. The path narrowed as I ventured deeper, the trees growing taller and closer together. The light dimmed and the air grew cooler, carrying a faint, sweet smell that reminded me of blooming flowers after rain. The hum was clearer now, weaving through the rustling of the leaves like a hidden melody. I found myself in a small clearing. The sunlight barely reached here, filtered through a dense canopy overhead. In the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any I had ever seen. Its bark was pale and smooth, almost glowing in the dim light, and its branches spread wide, draped with leaves that shimmered as if touched by starlight. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. The hum was emanating from the tree itself, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a feeling, a warmth that spread through me, dissolving the stress and fatigue I'd been carrying. I reached out, almost without thinking, and placed my hand on the bark. It was cool to the touch, but the moment I made contact, a wave of emotion surged through me. It was as if the tree was sharing its memories, centuries of quiet observation, of storms weathered and sunlight cherished. I felt a profound sense of peace, as though I was part of something far greater than myself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the hum faded. The forest was silent again, save for the gentle rustle of leaves. I stood there for a while, my hands still on the tree, feeling more connected to the world around me than I had in years. As I made my way back, the forest felt different. Or maybe it was me who had changed. The whisper of the leaves sounded softer, more intimate, as if they were telling me secrets meant only for me. The golden light filtering through the trees seemed warmer, more welcoming. When I finally emerged from the forest, the weight I'd carried all day was gone. In its place was a calmness that lingered long after I returned home, a feeling of being cradled by something timeless and eternal. That night, I slept better than I had in years, with the whisper of the leaves still echoing softly in my mind, a lullaby from the heart of the forest. The forest didn't answer, of course, but the hum grew a little louder, almost playful, as if beckoning me to follow. I hesitated for a moment. This forest was vast, and though I knew it well, there were corners I hadn't ventured into. But something about that sound was impossible to resist. It wasn't threatening, if anything. It felt like an invitation, a promise of something extraordinary. The path narrowed as I ventured deeper, the trees growing taller and closer together. The light dimmed and the air grew cooler, carrying a faint, sweet smell that reminded me of blooming flowers after rain. As I stepped deeper into the woods, the sunlight transformed the forest into something magical. Every leaf it touched seemed to glow. Every shadow it created danced playfully on the ground. It was like stepping into a painting, except this wasn't art, it was alive, breathing, and unfolding right in front of me. I stopped for a moment, standing perfectly still. The interplay of light and shadow on the forest floor was mesmerizing, as though the trees themselves were playing a quiet game of hide and seek. Each beam of sunlight that broke through the canopy felt deliberate, like it had chosen its place carefully, illuminating a fern here, a moss-covered rock there. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me. In that moment, memories surfaced on mine, some that didn't feel like they belonged to me at all. I saw flashes of sunlight filtering through leaves in different seasons, heard the laughter of children, felt the cool touch of rain against bark. The tree wasn't just alive, it was ancient, carrying within it the echoes of countless moments. In the distance, the sunlight seemed to linger on a specific spot, brighter and more concentrated than anywhere else. It was as if the forest was pointing the way, urging me to follow. Curiosity tugged at me, and I began to move toward the light. The deeper I walked, the denser the trees became, their branches interlocking above me like a cathedral ceiling. The air grew cooler, the sunlight more golden, almost honey-like in its richness. Shadows stretched long and thin, weaving intricate patterns across the ground. I reached a small clearing where the sunlight poured in unabated, bathing the area in a golden glow so intense it felt otherworldly. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its bark pale and smooth, its branches reaching upward as if in prayer. The sunlight seemed to gravitate toward it, illuminating its leaves in a way that made them shimmer, as if they were made of gold. I approached slowly, my heart beating a little faster. There was something sacred about the place, something that made me want to whisper instead of speak. As I stepped into the light, the warmth was immediate, wrapping around me like a soft blanket. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was deeper, as if the light was reaching into the very core of me. For a moment, everything else faded away. The forest was silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves high above. The tree in the clearing seemed to pulse with life, its leaves swaying gently, even though there was no breeze. I reached out and let my fingers graze one of its lower branches, and then I felt it. It was faint at first, like the smallest ripple in a still pond, but it grew stronger a vibration, an energy that traveled from the tree to my fingertips and spread through my body. It wasn't frightening, it was calming, like the hum of a distant melody that you can't quite place but know you've heard before. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me. In that moment, memories surfaced, some mine, some that didn't feel like they belonged to me at all. I saw flashes of sunlight filtering through leaves in different seasons, heard the laughter of children, felt the cool touch of rain against bark. The tree wasn't just alive, it was ancient, carrying within it the echoes of countless moments. When I opened my eyes, the golden light seemed softer now, gentler, as though it had shared its secret and was content to let me go. I took a step back, my hand falling away from the branch, and a deep sense of gratitude filled me. As I made my way back to the path, the sunlight continued to play its quiet games, casting golden patterns on the ground that seemed to guide my steps. The forest felt even more alive now, its whispers more distinct, its shadows less intimidating. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I turned back for one last look, and there it was, the golden light, still streaming through the canopy, a reminder of the magic I had just experienced. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the clearing, the tree, the light. It was a memory that didn't just stay in my mind, it lingered in my heart, a warm glow that refused to fade. And as I drifted off to sleep, the golden filter of the forest filled my dreams, wrapping me in its quiet embrace. The air was thick with quiet as I stepped deeper into the forest, leaving the distant hum of the outside world far behind. This wasn't the kind of silence you might find in an empty room. I approached slowly, my heart beating a little faster. There was something sacred about the place, something that made me want to whisper instead of speak. As I stepped into the light, the warmth was immediate, wrapping around me like a soft blanket. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was deeper, as if the light was reaching into the very core of me. It was as if nature herself was the conductor, and every rustle, chirp, and snap was a carefully chosen note. In the distance, a bird called out, its voice sharp and clear, like a flute cutting through the stillness. Another answered, softer, more cautious, as though it didn't want to disturb the balance. I paused for a moment, letting the calls wash over me. They seemed to bounce from tree to tree, creating an invisible web of connection that stretched far beyond what my eyes could see. I tilted my head, listening closer. Somewhere nearby, water trickled over stones, the sound faint but steady, like a quiet heartbeat. It wasn't visible from where I stood, but I could feel its presence, its gentle persistence as it shaped the earth in its slow, patient way. The forest floor was soft and uneven, blanketed in a thick layer of fallen leaves that muted my steps. Yet every now and then, the crunch of a particularly dry leaf would echo louder than expected, breaking the spell of the quiet momentarily. It was surprising how such a small sound could feel so large here, surrounded by towering trees and endless sky. Then came the snap of a twig, sharp and sudden. My breath caught in my throat as I froze mid-step. It wasn't me. This sound came from somewhere else, somewhere just beyond the reach of my vision. I scanned the trees, my heart quickening. The forest, which had felt so welcoming moments before, now seemed to hold its breath. "Hello," I called out, my voice low and unsure. The sound of it felt intrusive, breaking the delicate balance of the silence. There was no reply, just the faint rustle of leaves swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. Slowly I exhaled, letting my shoulders relax. Probably just a deer, I told myself. Or a squirrel, maybe. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The forest seemed to shift with me as I moved, the symphony of sounds adapting to my presence. A woodpecker began its rhythmic tapping high above, the sound echoing like a distant drum. Nearby, the faint buzz of an insect joined in, its wings creating a gentle hum that blended perfectly with the rustling leaves. Despite the earlier unease, these sounds were ancient, timeless, a reminder of life's unbroken continuity. They weren't made for me, yet I felt privileged to hear them, to be a part of this fleeting moment. Another bird call, this one softer, almost mournful, drew my attention to a patch of sunlight filtering through the canopy. A small clearing opened before me, its floor covered in ferns that swayed gently in the breeze. I stepped into the light, feeling its warmth on my skin. For a while I stood there, letting the forest's symphony envelop me. The occasional rustle of leaves, the faint creak of a branch under some unseen weight. Even the far-off calls of creatures I couldn't name at all came together in a harmony that felt as old as the earth itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the symphony shifted. A new sound entered the mix, faint and distant, almost imperceptible at first. It was low and steady, like the hum of a deep, resonant drum. It seemed to pulse through the air, more felt than heard, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint its source, but the forest around me remained still. The sound wasn't threatening. Exactly, it was more like a question, a presence that wanted to be noticed. My heart raced as I took a hesitant step toward it, every crunch of my boots feeling unnaturally loud in the growing quiet. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the sound faded. The forest returned to its usual symphony, the distant bird calls and rustling leaves filling the air once more. But something had changed. I couldn't quite explain it, but I felt lighter, as though the forest had shared a secret with me, one I wasn't meant to fully understand. As I made my way back to the trail, the sounds of the forest followed me, soft and persistent. Each step felt like a parting note in a song I didn't want to end. When I finally emerged from the woods, the weight of the day had lifted, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in ages. That night, as I lay in bed, the symphony of the forest echoed in my mind. The gentle rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the occasional mysterious snap of a twig each sound lingered, lulling me into a peaceful, dreamless sleep. Despite the earlier unease, there was something deeply comforting about it all. These sounds were ancient, timeless, a reminder of life's unbroken continuity. They weren't made for me, yet I felt privileged to hear them, to be a part of this fleeting moment. Another bird call, this one softer, almost mournful, drew my attention to a patch of sunlight filtering through the canopy. A small clearing opened before me, its floor covered in ferns that swayed gently in the breeze. Each step released their scent, sharp yet soothing, as though the forest itself was breathing out a sigh of welcome. I paused for a moment and crouched down, letting my hand brush against the ground. The soil was dark and damp, cool to the touch. Its scent rose to meet me, deep and ancient, like a memory of rainstorms and sunlit mornings woven into the very fabric of the earth. It was a smell I couldn't describe, yet it was unmistakably familiar, like an old friend I hadn't seen in years. As I stood, I inhaled deeply, letting the air fill my lungs. It wasn't just air, it was life itself, laced with the faint sweetness of moss clinging to rocks and tree trunks. There was something humbling about it, this invisible thread tying me to the forest, to the ground beneath my feet. Further down the path, the aroma shifted subtly. I caught the faint scent of damp wood, the kind that comes from fallen logs blanketed in moss. I stopped beside one, running my fingers over its rough surface. The texture was uneven, the wood softened by years of rain and shadow. Its scent was earthy, almost musky, and carried with it the quiet promise of renewal. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves and stirring the air around me. That night, as I lay in bed, the scent of the forest lingered in my memory. It was there in the quiet moments before sleep, a gentle reminder of the grounding power of nature. And as I drifted off, I felt as though I was still walking that path, the smell of pine and earth guiding me into a peaceful, dreamless rest. As I walked, the scents deepened, layered with something darker, more mysterious. It was the smell of damp stones, cool and solid, as if they had soaked in the rain for centuries. It made me think of caves and streams, of places untouched by sunlight, but alive with their own quiet energy. There was an unexpected comfort in that darkness, a grounding force that made me feel as though I belonged here. The forest didn't care about the worries I had carried in with me. It didn't ask for explanations or excuses. It simply existed, offering its scents and sounds as a quiet balm for my soul. A crackling sound startled me, sharp and sudden. My heart leaped, and I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the stillness felt different now, heavier. The forest, which had been so open and welcoming, seemed to draw closer, its scents more concentrated, more enveloping. Is someone there? My voice broke the silence, and for a moment it felt as though the forest held its breath. But no reply came, only the faint rustle of leaves high above. I shook off the unease and continued walking, though my steps were slower now, more deliberate. The path twisted and narrowed, and the earthy scent grew stronger, almost overwhelming. It was as if the forest wanted me to stop, to breathe it in fully, to let go of whatever weight I was still carrying. I found myself in a small, shaded hollow, where the air was thick with the smell of moss and soil. I knelt down and pressed my palms into the ground, feeling its cool, damp texture against my skin. The scent rose around me, calming and grounding, as though the earth itself was speaking to me, reminding me that I was part of something much larger, much older. For a moment, I stayed there, my eyes closed, my breathing slow. The forest had become a sanctuary, not just for my body, but for my mind. The scents that filled the air, pine, moss, soil, and stone, were more than just smells. They were anchors, pulling me back to myself, back to the present moment. When I finally stood and began walking again, the forest seemed lighter, its scents less intense, but no less comforting. I emerged from the woods feeling cleansed, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, as I lay in bed, the scent of the forest lingered in my memory. It was there in the quiet moments before sleep, a gentle reminder of the grounding power of nature. And as I drifted off, I felt as though I was still walking that path, the smell of pine and earth guiding me into a peaceful, dreamless rest. The scents that filled the air, pine, moss, soil, and stone, were more than just smells. They were anchors, pulling me back to myself, back to the present moment. When I finally stood and began walking again, the forest seemed lighter, its scents less intense, but no less comforting. I emerged from the woods feeling cleansed, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. I followed the sound instinctively, my steps quickening as the forest seemed to shift and rearrange itself. The trees stood taller here, their trunks thick with moss that glowed faintly in the dappled sunlight. The path narrowed further, forcing me to step carefully over roots and rocks, each movement bringing the sound closer. And then I saw it. A small stream wound its way through the forest, its waters shimmering as they caught the light filtering through the canopy. The sight stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't grand or imposing. It was quiet, unassuming, and utterly beautiful. The water bubbled over smooth stones, its surface dancing with sunlight, as though the stream itself was alive and joyful. I stepped closer, feeling the ground soften beneath my boots. The earthy scent of damp soil mixed with the fresh, crisp aroma of the water. It was intoxicating, a reminder of how simple and pure the world could be. I knelt by the edge, dipping my fingers into the stream. The water was cold, its touch both shocking and invigorating. As I watched the current flow, I noticed small details, tiny fish darting between the rocks. The way the water shaped the stones over time, smoothing their edges. It struck me how patient the stream was, how it moved with such quiet persistence, carving its path through the forest without hesitation. I sat there for what felt like hours, the sound of the water filling the silence around me. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a voice speaking in a language I couldn't fully understand but felt deeply in my bones. The stream seemed to carry stories, memories of rain and storms, of leaves that had drifted on its surface and stones that had rested beneath it. Suddenly, there was a rustle nearby. My heart leaped, and I turned sharply, scanning the trees. For a moment, everything felt still, too still, as though the forest was holding its breath. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a deer, stepping cautiously from the shadows. It paused at the edge of the stream, its ears twitching as it bent its head to drink. I held my breath, not wanting to disturb the moment. The deer's movements were graceful, deliberate, as though it was aware of being watched, but unbothered by my presence. And then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it was gone, slipping back into the forest. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest easing. The stream's voice seemed louder now, its steady murmur grounding me once more. I reached down and scooped a handful of water, letting it trickle through my fingers. The cold seeped into my skin, a gentle reminder of the stream's persistence, its unyielding flow. It didn't care who watched or listened. It simply was. As I stood to leave, I felt an unexpected pang of sadness. The stream had become a sanctuary, a quiet refuge in the midst of the forest's vastness, but I knew I couldn't stay forever. The trail called to me, promising more discoveries, more moments like this one. I took one last look at the water, watching as it sparkled like 1,000 tiny diamonds in the sunlight. Its song stayed with me as I walked away, a soft, steady rhythm that echoed in my mind long after the sound had faded. That night, as I lay in bed, the stream came back to me. Each patch seemed to glow faintly in the muted light filtering through the trees, a kaleidoscope of emerald and jade. I crouched down and ran my hand over it, marveling at the texture. It was cool and springy, as though the earth itself had grown a protective layer to cushion the harshness of the world. As I stood and began walking again, I noticed how the moss seemed to muffle not just my footsteps, but everything around me. Beneath my feet, the forest floor was blanketed in a layer of moss, so thick and velvety it seemed to absorb the very sound of my steps. It was beautiful, this mossy pathway, a soft, living carpet woven in shades of green so vibrant it felt almost unreal. Each patch seemed to glow faintly in the muted light filtering through the trees, a kaleidoscope of emerald and jade. I crouched down and ran my hand over it, marveling at the texture. It was cool and springy, as though the earth itself had grown a protective layer to cushion the harshness of the world. As I stood and began walking again, I noticed how the moss seemed to muffle not just my footsteps, but everything around me. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, even the occasional snap of a twig faded into the background, leaving only the gentle rhythm of my breathing and the subtle shift of my weight with each step. The silence was soothing, but there was something else beneath it, a presence I couldn't quite name. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest easing. The stream's voice seemed louder now, its steady murmur grounding me once more. I reached down and scooped a handful of water, letting it trickle through my fingers. The cold seeped into my skin, a gentle reminder of the stream's persistence, its unyielding flow. It didn't care who watched or listened. It simply was. As I stood to leave, I felt an unexpected pang of sadness. The stream had become a sanctuary, a quiet refuge in the midst of the forest's vastness. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint, earthy scent of moss mixed with damp wood and soil. I came to a clearing where the moss was especially thick, pooling around the base of an ancient oak that towered above the other trees. Its gnarled roots twisted and turned like something out of a fairy tale, and the moss clung to them, softening their edges and giving the entire scene an otherworldly feel. I couldn't resist sitting down, letting the moss cradle me like an old, familiar friend. As I leaned back against the oak's massive trunk, I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the stillness. The moss seemed to hold me in place, as though it was trying to draw something out of me, something I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Memories, worries, the weight of 100 small burdens, all of it seemed to rise to the surface, only to dissolve into the soft, forgiving ground beneath me. And then, faintly, I heard it. A sound so quiet I wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. It was like a whisper, low and melodic, coming from somewhere beneath the moss. I opened my eyes and sat up, my heart pounding despite the calmness around me. Is someone there? My voice sounded small, swallowed by the thick air of the clearing. There was no response, but the whispering continued, soft and steady, like the forest was trying to share a secret just out of reach. I stood and took a tentative step forward, my boots sinking slightly into the moss. The whispering grew louder, though it was still impossible to tell where it was coming from. I knelt down, pressing my hands into the moss, half expecting to feel the vibration of a voice beneath my palms. But there was nothing, just the cool, spongy texture of the moss and the faint, rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hands back, suddenly feeling like an intruder. The mossy pathway, which had felt so inviting moments ago, now seemed to close in around me. The trees leaned closer, their moss-covered trunks looming like silent sentinels. I stood quickly, brushing off the feeling and stepping back onto the path. The whispering faded as I walked, the forest returning to its quiet, watchful state. But the memory of it lingered, a faint echo that followed me as I made my way out of the clearing. When I finally emerged from the forest, the mossy pathway behind me, I felt both relieved and a little sad. The moss had been more than a trail. It had been a witness, a keeper of secrets I couldn't quite understand. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the moss and its whispers. There was a comfort in its silence, in the way it had absorbed my steps and my thoughts, even as it held something unknowable within its depths. I drifted off to sleep with the memory of its cool, velvety touch, feeling lighter, as though the forest had taken some part of my burdens and folded them into its quiet, endless green. The path was soft beneath my boots, muffled by a scattering of pine needles and the gentle layer of forest debris that had fallen over time. The air was cool and still, carrying the faintest whisper of wood smoke from somewhere far beyond the trees. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, and for a moment I thought that maybe I was. As I walked, I became more aware of the forest's subtle movements, the way the leaves stirred as a breeze rippled through the canopy, the slight sway of branches far above. The world felt alive, though I had yet to see anything to confirm it. And then I heard it. The lightest rustle, a sound so faint it could have been imagined. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The noise came again, this time from my right, just beyond the trees. Slowly I turned, scanning the underbrush for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing, just the play of light and shadow across the dense greenery. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a small, flickering motion, barely noticeable. A squirrel, its fur a rich, warm brown, darted across the forest floor. It stopped abruptly at the base of a tree, its tiny body tense as it turned to look at me. Its eyes were bright, almost too large for its face, and they seemed to hold a kind of curiosity I hadn't expected. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hands back, suddenly feeling like an intruder. The mossy pathway, which had felt so inviting moments ago, now seemed to close in around me. The trees leaned closer, their moss-covered trunks looming like silent sentinels. I stood quickly, brushing off the feeling and stepping back onto the path. The light grew softer here, filtered through the dense canopy above. I was so lost in the rhythm of my steps that I almost missed the sound of quiet, tentative crackle of leaves. This time, it came from ahead. I slowed my pace, my heart quickening with a mix of anticipation and unease. The sound grew louder as I approached, each step bringing me closer to its source. And then I saw it. A deer, standing in a small clearing just off the path. Its coat was a soft, tawny brown, and it seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight. Its ears twitched as it lifted its head, its dark eyes locking onto mine. I froze, afraid to startle it, though I could feel my pulse racing in my chest. The deer didn't run. Instead, it stood perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that felt almost human. There was a quiet intelligence in its gaze, a depth that made me feel both seen and understood in a way I couldn't quite explain. I stayed where I was, not daring to move closer. The air between us felt charged, alive with something I didn't have words for. Time seemed to stretch, each second hanging heavy and full. Then, slowly, the deer lowered its head and began to graze, its movements graceful and unhurried. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the tension in my shoulders easing. It felt like a gift this moment, and I was careful not to take it for granted. Eventually, the deer lifted its head again, its ears flicking toward some distant sound I couldn't hear. It turned and walked away, its steps almost soundless as it disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where it had been. The forest felt quieter now, as though it, too, was acknowledging the significance of what had just happened. As I continued my walk, I couldn't shake the feeling of connection that the squirrel and the deer had left behind. I stopped and looked down, marveling at the intricate patterns the roots created. They seemed alive, not just in the sense of being part of the towering trees they supported, but alive in their own right. Each twist, each curve, told a stories older than anything I could imagine. As I stepped carefully over them, I felt a peculiar sense of reverence. I closed my eyes, the soft rustle of leaves and the quiet crackle of twigs still echoing in my mind. It was a comfort, a lullaby of the natural world. And as I drifted into sleep, I felt a peace I hadn't known I needed. The air grew heavier the deeper I ventured into the forest. The sounds of civilization had long faded, replaced by the quiet symphony of nature. My footsteps, soft against the dirt path, soon met resistance as the trail began to change. The ground, once smooth and forgiving, was now crisscrossed by ancient tree roots. They twisted and turned, jutting out like the veins of the earth, their surfaces weathered and knotted from centuries of growth. I stopped and looked down, marveling at the intricate patterns the roots created. They seemed alive, not just in the sense of being part of the towering trees they supported, but alive in their own right. Each twist, each curve, told a stories older than anything I could imagine. As I stepped carefully over them, I felt a peculiar sense of reverence. It was as though I was walking across something sacred, the very bones of the forest. The roots weren't just obstacles, they were pathways, reminders of the connection between the earth and the life it sustained. One particularly massive root caught my eye. It arched high above the ground like a natural bridge, its surface rough and ridged. I reached out and touched it, half expecting to feel a pulse beneath my fingers. The bark was cool, its texture a blend of smooth grooves and jagged edges, and I felt a strange comfort in its solidity. The forest grew quieter as I continued, the air thick with a kind of ancient energy. The roots seemed to multiply, spreading out in all directions, some disappearing into the shadows of the underbrush, others rising to meet the trunks of nearby trees. I couldn't help but feel small in their presence, like an uninvited guest in a realm that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint creaking like the groan of wood under pressure. I froze, my heart quickening. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the usual rustle of leaves. It was deeper, more deliberate, as if the forest itself was shifting. "Hello." My voice was barely above a whisper, swallowed almost instantly by the dense air. There was no reply, but the creaking stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. I shook off the unease and kept moving, though my steps were slower now, more cautious. The roots beneath me seemed to rise higher, forcing me to step carefully to avoid tripping. My hands occasionally brushed against the rough bark for balance, and I felt a strange sense of connection, as if the trees were guiding me forward. Then I saw it. Ahead in a small clearing was a tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its roots were massive, twisting and curling in impossible shapes, creating a labyrinth around its base. The tree itself was ancient, its trunk thick and gnarled, with branches that stretched high into the canopy. Moss clung to its surface, and faint streaks of sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting intricate patterns on the ground below. I approached cautiously, drawn to the tree's presence. There was something about it that felt different, almost alive in a way that went beyond the usual vitality of plants. I knelt beside one of its roots, running my fingers over the grooves and ridges. The bark was rough, but there was a warmth to it, a quiet hum that I felt more than heard. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the stillness of the clearing wash over me. I could almost hear the whispers of the forest, soft and distant, like voices carried on the wind. They weren't words, not exactly, but they held a rhythm, a cadence that felt ancient and wise. When I opened my eyes, I noticed something I hadn't before. Between the roots, tucked into the earth, were small shoots of new growth, tiny saplings, sprouting in the shadows of the giant tree. They were delicate, their leaves bright and vibrant against the dark soil. It was a reminder that even here, in the midst of age and decay, life continued to renew itself. I stood and took a deep breath, the earthy scent of the forest filling my lungs, the twisting roots, the ancient tree, the tiny saplings. They were all part of a story much larger than myself. It was humbling and comforting all at once, a reminder that life was both fleeting and eternal. As I made my way back to the path, the forest seemed to embrace me, its stillness no longer heavy but peaceful. I approached cautiously, drawn to the tree's presence. There was something about it that felt different, almost alive in a way that went beyond the usual vitality of plants. I knelt beside one of its roots, running my fingers over the grooves and ridges. The bark was rough, but there was a warmth to it, a quiet hum that I felt more than heard. The air was dense with an earthy stillness as I wandered deeper into the forest. The towering trees around me stood as silent sentinels, their leaves murmuring softly in the faint breeze. There was a peculiar sense of timelessness here, as if the woods had always existed, untouched by the hands of man. My steps slowed as something unusual caught my eye. It stood alone, slightly apart from the other trees, as though it had claimed its own space in this vast green expanse. Its trunk was massive, its bark dark and furrowed, worn by countless seasons, but it was the hollow at its base that drew me closer. The hollow was large enough for a person to crouch inside. It yawned open like a dark, inviting doorway. Something about it sent a shiver down my spine, mix of curiosity and a twinge of unease. The edges of the hollow were rough, but smooth enough to suggest the passage of time had shaped it, perhaps even the hands of the elements. I crouched down, peering into the shadowy interior. It was darker than I expected, even though the sunlight outside was filtering through the canopy above. I couldn't see much beyond a few inches of the inner walls. They were lined with soft moss, and faint scratches ran across the surface, almost like the marks of tiny claws or tools. What could have made this? I murmured aloud, my voice hushed, as though I were afraid to disturb the tree. For a moment I hesitated. It felt like crossing a threshold, stepping into something sacred or forbidden. But the pull of curiosity was stronger than the whisper of caution in the back of my mind. Slowly, I reached inside, my hand brushing against the cool, damp interior. The texture was soft, almost velvety, and there was a faint, woody aroma mixed with the smell of damp earth. As I withdrew my hand, my fingers grazed something solid, a small, smooth object wedged within the hollow. I pulled it out carefully and held it up to the light. It was a stone, worn round and polished, with faint carvings etched into its surface. The symbols were indecipherable, ancient in their design, but there was a strange beauty to them. I stood holding the stone in my palm and looked around. The forest seemed unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by a person, but by the woods themselves. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving, despite the occasional gust of wind. A sudden rustling broke the silence, and I turned sharply toward the sound. It came from somewhere behind the hollow tree, a quick and fleeting movement in the underbrush. My heart raced as I scanned the shadows, but whatever had caused it was gone. It's just an animal, I told myself, though my voice felt too loud, too out of place in the quiet. I glanced back at the hollow tree, feeling its presence more keenly now. The carved stone in my hand felt heavier, as though it carried a weight beyond its physical form. I placed it back inside the hollow, tucking it carefully into the moss where I had found it. Somehow it felt wrong to take it with me, as though I would be disturbing something ancient and sacred. As I stepped back, a peculiar sound reached my ears, a low groaning creak, like wood bending under pressure. It came from the tree, its trunk seeming to shift ever so slightly. My breath caught, and for a moment I felt frozen in place. But then the sound faded, and the forest returned to its tranquil stillness. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my chest easing. Perhaps it was just the natural settling of the tree, I told myself, though a part of me wasn't entirely convinced. Before leaving, I placed my hand gently on the tree's bark. It felt warm, almost alive, as if it recognized my presence. "Thank you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was thanking. As I walked away, the hollow tree lingered in my thoughts. There was a mystery there, a story etched into its ancient wood, one I would likely never fully understand, but it left me with a sense of wonder, a feeling that the forest was more than just a collection of trees and plants. It was alive, full of secrets and stories waiting to be discovered. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of the hollow tree. Its dark interior, the carved stone, the faint sounds that had seemed to emanate from it, they played over and over in my mind. But instead of fear, I felt a deep peace, a connection to something much larger than myself. The forest had shared a piece of its soul with me, and I carried it with me as I drifted off to sleep, cradled by the memory of its timeless embrace. The forest stretched out before me, an endless expanse of towering pines. Their slender trunks reached skyward, and their dark green needles swayed gently in the breeze. The sound they made was unlike anything else, a soft, rhythmic murmur that seemed to carry whispers of the ancient woods. It wasn't loud or insistent, but soothing, as if the trees themselves were speaking in a language only the forest could understand. I paused on the narrow trail, closing my eyes to let the sound envelop me. The murmuring pines were like an orchestra of nature, their voices rising and falling in harmony with the wind. It was calming yet powerful, and it stirred something deep within me, a sense of being connected to something far greater than myself. As I walked further, the path narrowed and the trees grew closer together, their thick canopy filtering the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. The temperature dropped slightly, the coolness wrapping around me like a gentle embrace. Every step I took on the soft forest floor seemed quieter here, muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. The air was rich with the scent of resin and earth, grounding and comforting. Yet, beneath that tranquility, there was a sense of mystery. It was as if the forest was alive, watching and listening as I moved. The murmurs of the pines grew more distinct, and I felt compelled to listen more closely, almost as if I might decipher their secrets. I stopped again when I noticed a peculiar shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't something I could see or touch, but I felt it, a faint charge in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. The wind stilled for a moment, and the pine murmurs ceased, leaving a silence so profound it made my heartbeat seem loud. A sudden rustling broke the stillness. I turned sharply, scanning the underbrush, but saw nothing. My pulse quickened, and I swallowed hard. "Probably just a squirrel," I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded small in the vastness of the forest. I moved cautiously now, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The trees around me seemed to close in, their towering forms casting long, eerie shadows. Yet the murmuring returned, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. It was as if the pines were reassuring me, calming my nerves. As I rounded a bend in the trail, a small clearing appeared, bathed in a pale golden light. In the center stood a single ancient pine, its trunk massive and gnarled with age. The way it swayed slightly, even in the absence of wind, gave it an almost sentient quality. I felt drawn to it, as if it were calling me. I approached slowly, my footsteps crunching softly on the pine needles. Standing beneath its sprawling branches, I placed a hand on the rough bark. It was warm to the touch, and I closed my eyes, feeling a deep sense of peace. The murmurs of the pines seemed louder here, as though the forest was singing directly to me. It was beautiful and haunting all at once. Then, as if on cue, the wind picked up again, stronger this time. The pines swayed and whispered in unison, their voices rising like a crescendo. I felt a chill run down my spine, not out of fear, but out of awe. It was as if I were standing in the heart of something sacred, something eternal. For a fleeting moment, I felt a presence not human, but something ancient and wise. It wasn't threatening, but it was overwhelming in its enormity. The forest, with all its whispers and secrets, felt alive in a way I had never experienced before. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see something extraordinary, but the clearing remained still, bathed in its serene glow. Taking a deep breath, I stepped back and continued on the trail. The murmurs of the pines faded as I moved away, but the feeling they left behind stayed with Mia's sense of belonging, of being part of the natural world's endless story. It was humbling and comforting all at once. As I made my way out of the forest, the murmurs grew faint, blending with the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves. The world outside the forest seemed brighter and louder, but the peace I had found within those ancient pines lingered in my heart. I carried it with me, a quiet reminder of the beauty and mystery that exists just beyond the edge of the known. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the murmuring pines lulled me to sleep, their whispers echoing softly in my dreams. The path ahead narrowed, framed by the towering trees whose branches interlocked like fingers, casting a soft shadow over the trail. The forest had been my haven for hours, its serene sounds and earthy scents wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I let out a long breath, allowing the quiet rhythm of the forest to calm my thoughts. Then it came a sudden chill. It was subtle at first, just a whisper of air brushing against the nape of my neck, like a fleeting thought I couldn't quite grasp. I stopped mid-step, confused by its abruptness. The sun still filtered gently through the leaves, casting warm streaks of light onto the forest floor. But the air had changed. It wasn't just cooler, it carried something else, something unspoken. Goosebumps prickled on my arms, and I felt the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. I glanced around, searching for the source of the breeze. The trees stood still, their branches swaying only faintly, as if they too were holding their breath. The forest, which moments ago had felt so alive and welcoming, now seemed to hesitate. The usual chirping of birds and the rustling of small creatures had gone quiet, replaced by a silence so profound it felt almost heavy. Strange, I murmured to myself, the sound of my voice breaking the stillness. Even as I spoke, the words seemed to dissolve, absorbed into the hushed atmosphere of the woods. I took a cautious step forward, feeling the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The chill lingered, pressing against my skin like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I told myself it was just the wind-a-rogue breeze sneaking through the dense forest, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. My steps became slower, more deliberate, each one echoing faintly in the quiet. Every now and then, the faintest shift of air would brush against me, and with it came a sensation I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, but an undeniable sense of being watched, of not being entirely alone. There was a bend in the path up ahead, and something in me hesitated. I stopped, peering into the curve, where the sunlight failed to reach. Shadows pooled in the hollow space, their edges blending into the bark of the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself. "It's just a forest," I whispered. "Just a walk." But as I turned the corner, the breeze returned, this time sharper, more deliberate. It circled me, almost playful, though it left a cold trail that seemed to seep into my bones. My heart began to pound, its rhythm echoing in my ears. The path here was narrower, lined with moss-covered roots that twisted like veins. The smell of damp earth was stronger now, almost overpowering. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease. Yet, with every step, the chill seemed to intensify. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the trail like fingers reaching out to touch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was near, moving just beyond my line of sight. Then a sound of faint rustle from somewhere to my left. My breath caught, and I turned sharply, scanning the dense underbrush. Nothing moved. I stared for a long moment, my eyes searching the tangled mass of ferns and low-hanging branches. "Probably a squirrel," I muttered under my breath, though the words felt hollow. My fingers curled tightly around the strap of my backpack as I forced myself to keep walking. The breeze shifted again, this time coming from behind me. It was unnervingly cold, as if it had traveled from some unseen depth of the forest. I stopped in my tracks, unable to ignore the weight of the moment. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the trail behind me. The forest stood silent, the trees unyielding sentinels in their ancient stillness. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the chill faded. Warmth returned to the air, soft and reassuring, as if the forest itself had exhaled. The bird song resumed, faint at first, but gradually filling the quiet spaces with life once more. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me like sunlight breaking through the clouds. Still, as I continued down the path, the memory of that sudden chill lingered. It wasn't just the temperature that had shifted. It was the forest's energy, an unspoken reminder that I was a visitor in a world far older and deeper than I could comprehend. The pines swayed gently once more, their murmurs returning to their calming rhythm, but I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder now and then. By the time I emerged from the woods, the chill was a distant memory, but its presence had left a mark. The forest had whispered something to me, though its meaning remained elusive. As I walked toward the fading light of the day, I carried that moment with me, tucked away like a secreter reminder of the quiet mysteries that dwell just beyond what we can see. The forest seemed endless, each step deeper, pulling me further from the world I knew. The air was thick with the scent of pine and moss, each breath grounding me in the present moment. My boots pressed softly into the earth, muffled by a carpet of fallen needles, their sound blending seamlessly into the quiet hum of nature. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy above, creating dappled patterns that danced with every sway of the trees. As I wandered, I noticed a faint glow ahead. It wasn't the usual golden light of the setting sun, but something softer, more diffused, as if the very air in that spot shimmered with a hidden energy. My curiosity piqued. I veered off the well-trodden path, carefully stepping over roots and under low-hanging branches. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew lighter, almost playful, and the faintest sound of a melodious sound, so delicate it could have been imagined, tickled my ears. And then, it wasn't large, perhaps the size of a small garden, but it felt infinite. The ground was covered in vibrant green moss, so lush it seemed to glow from within. Wildflowers in hues of white and pale lavender were scattered like stars across the expanse, their petals swaying gently, even though there was no breeze. The trees encircling the clearing stood tall and protective, their branches arching toward the center as if bowing to something unseen. The light that had drawn me here was indeed different. It bathed the clearing in a silvery radiance, as if the sun and moon had joined forces to create this moment. It wasn't glaring or overpowering, but soft, almost liquid, spilling over everything it touched. I stood at the edge, suddenly unsure. There was a presence in the air, intangible but undeniable, feeling that this space was alive, sacred in a way I couldn't quite explain. I took a tentative step forward. The moss gave under my weight like the softest cushion, and I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. My heartbeat, which had quickened in excitement, slowed to match the steady rhythm of the forest. The sounds of birds and distant rustling seemed to fade, replaced by an enveloping silence that wasn't empty but full, as if the clearing itself was speaking in a language too ancient to comprehend. I crouched down, running my fingers over the moss. It was cool to the touch, its texture impossibly delicate, yet resilient. As I knelt there, I noticed a faint shimmer in the air, like the heat waves that rise off asphalt on a summer's day, but softer, almost ethereal. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Either way, I felt no fear, only wonder. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A small butterfly, its wings a mesmerizing blend of gold and deep blue, fluttered into the clearing. It moved with a grace that seemed deliberate, almost purposeful, circling me once before landing on a flower nearby. Its presence felt significant, though I couldn't say why. It was as if it had come to greet me, to acknowledge my intrusion into this magical space. I sat down fully, crossing my legs and letting myself sink into the moss. Time lost all meaning. I didn't know if I had been there minutes or hours, and I didn't care. The clearing felt like a world unto itself, untouched by the chaos of life outside the forest. It was a sanctuary, a place that demanded nothing and gave everything. A sudden rustle in the surrounding trees brought me back to the moment. My gaze darted to the edge of the clearing, where the shadows seemed to shift. For a brief second, I thought I saw a figure, a tall, slender silhouette that melted back into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. My breath caught, but the feeling wasn't fear. It was curiosity, mingled with a profound sense of respect. Whatever it was, it belonged here far more than I did. As the light in the clearing began to fade, replaced by the cool hues of twilight, I knew it was time to leave. I rose slowly, brushing off my hands and taking one last look around. The butterfly was gone, the shimmer in the air less pronounced, but the sense of peace remained, etched into my very being. I stepped back onto the forest path, the clearing vanishing behind me, as though it had never been there. The forest seemed different now, still beautiful, still serene, but lacking the otherworldly magic of the space I had just left. My steps were lighter as I made my way home, my mind replaying the experience over and over, each detail vivid and alive. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the clearing had been more than just a physical place. It was an invitation, a reminder of the quiet magic that exists in the world, if we only take the time to look. The forest was alive with its usual symphony, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the occasional call of a bird somewhere high in the canopy, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the trail. It was a walk I'd taken countless times, the path familiar and well marked. But something was different today. The air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. To the left, where the path usually continued uninterrupted, a cluster of overgrown bushes obscured the way. I paused, frowning, and scanned the area. A faint gap between the trees caught my trail, narrow and barely visible, winding deeper into the forest. It wasn't marked, and I couldn't recall ever seeing it before. My heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. I hesitated, the sensible part of me urging caution, but the pull of the unknown was irresistible. I adjusted the strap of my backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the forgotten trail. The forest seemed to change the moment I left the main path. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, as if the trees had conspired to create a roof of interlocking branches. The trail was soft underfoot, carpeted with layers of moss and fallen leaves. My steps were muffled, and the quiet around me became almost oppressive. I was alone, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The further I walked, the more the trail narrowed. It twisted and turned unpredictably, forcing me to duck under low branches and step over tangled roots. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their bark darkened by time and weather. They loomed over me, their branches creaking faintly in the wind. The sense of isolation deepened, but so did the feeling of being somewhere untouched by the modern world. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. That's when I noticed a faint smell in the air, earthy and damp, mingled with something sweet and unfamiliar. It was both comforting and unsettling, like a memory just out of reach. Ahead, the trail seemed to vanish into a thicket of brambles, their thorny vines twisted and impenetrable. But through the gaps, I could see a faint glow. It wasn't sunlight. It was softer, almost otherworldly, pulsating gently, as if alive. Curiosity overrode caution once again. I approached slowly, pushing aside branches and carefully stepping through the undergrowth. As I emerged on the other side, I found myself in a small clearing. The ground was uneven, the grass sparse and dotted with wildflowers that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. In the center stood a single tree, its trunk hollowed and blackened as if struck by lightning long ago. The air was heavier here, almost suffocating, yet I felt an odd sense of calm. I stepped closer to the tree, drawn by an inexplicable urge. The hollow in its trunk was larger than I'd thought, large enough for someone to step inside. As I peered into the darkness, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't empty. Inside the hollow, nestled among the decayed wood and moss, was something shiny, small and metallic, catching the faint light from the clearing. My hand trembled as I reached for it, half expecting something to grab me from within. When my fingers brushed the object, a jolt shot through, may not painful, but enough to make me pull back sharply. My breath caught in my throat. It was a locket, old and tarnished, with intricate carvings that time had softened. I turned it over in my hands, noticing an inscription on the back. The words were faded, but I could just make out the phrase, "To find is to remember." A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, rattling the branches and sending leaves swirling around me. The temperature plummeted, and goosebumps rose on my arms. It felt as if the forest was warning me, urging me to leave. The weight of the locket in my palm felt heavier now, almost unbearable. I didn't linger. Clutching the locket tightly, I retraced my steps back through the brambles and onto the trail. The sense of being watched followed me all the way, though I never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. When I finally stumbled back onto the main path, the air felt lighter, the sunlight warmer. The forest returned to its usual rhythm, as if nothing had happened. That night, as I lay in bed, the events replayed in my mind. The locket sat on my bedside table, its inscription glowing faintly in the moonlight. I still didn't know what it meant or why it had been hidden in that hollow tree. But one thing was certain: the forest had shared one of its secrets with me, and I was forever changed. The forest always felt like a sanctuary to me. Its towering trees, dappled sunlight, and gentle rustling leaves created a world far removed from the chaos of daily life. That day, I set out with the intention of walking off the week's stress, letting the woods envelop me in their calming embrace. The air was cool and fresh, tinged with the earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves. As I stepped deeper into the woods, the usual sounds of the forest accompanied me. Birds chirped in the distance, the faint hum of insects buzzed in the background, and the steady crunch of my boots on the trail was a grounding rhythm. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But something began to change as I wandered further from the well-worn path. The shift was subtle at first, like the slow fading of a melody. The forest grew quieter. The bird song ceased, the insects hushed, and even the wind seemed to stall, leaving the trees motionless. My footsteps, once comforting, now felt intrusive, their sound amplified in the growing silence. I paused, looking around, my heart beating a little faster. It was then that I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. You know that prickling feeling at the back of your neck when someone's eyes linger too long? It was like that. I turned slowly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. The trees stood tall and silent, their bark dark and ancient. The undergrowth was dense, a tangle of ferns and moss that seemed undisturbed. "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the stillness, too loud and out of place. I half expected someone or something to answer, but only silence greeted me. I shook my head, laughing nervously at my own unease. It was just my imagination, I told myself, a natural response to the solitude of the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I pressed on, determined not to let irrational fears spoil my walk. The trail narrowed as it wound between towering oaks, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands toward the sky. Shadows stretched across the path, and the light grew dimmer, though the sun had not yet set. The sense of being watched followed me, a constant companion. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. My breath hitched as I turned sharply, scanning the trees. There it was, again a flicker of motion, quick and subtle, like a shadow darting between trunks. My pulse quickened. It could be an animal, I reasoned, a deer or maybe a fox. But there was no sound, no rustling leaves or snapping twigs, nothing to suggest movement at all. Who's there? My voice was steadier this time, though my palms were damp. I stepped closer to where I'd seen the movement, peering into the undergrowth. Again, nothing. The forest was unnervingly still, as if holding its breath. Then came the whisper of faint, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too human. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I felt a chill creep over me, despite the warmth of the day. I decided to turn back. The idea of continuing deeper into the woods no longer felt appealing. As I retraced my steps, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't entirely benign either. It was as if the forest itself had grown curious about me, its unseen inhabitants studying my every move. The whispers returned, more distinct this time, though still unintelligible. They seemed to drift from all directions, carried by a breeze that didn't touch the trees. My steps quickened, the crunch of leaves beneath me now a frantic rhythm. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the voices, but the forest revealed nothing. Finally, I broke into a small clearing. The sunlight streamed through the canopy, bathing the ground in a golden glow. The whispers stopped, and the weight of unseen eyes lifted. I dropped to my knees, catching my breath, the tension slowly easing from my body. The clearing felt different, almost sacred, as if it were a safe haven from whatever had been following me. As I sat there, I noticed something carved into one of the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was faint, weathered by time, but unmistakable, a series of symbols, their meaning unknown. They were intricate, almost elegant, and they radiated a strange sense of calm. I reached out to trace them with my fingers, but before I could, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. It was soft, almost soothing, and it said just one word: go. I didn't need to be told twice. The forest had given me a reprieve, a moment of peace in the midst of its mystery, but it was clear that my presence was no longer welcome. I stood, brushing the dirt from my knees, and made my way back to the main trail. The feeling of being watched didn't return, and the forest gradually came back to life. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the warmth of the sun seeped into my skin. By the time I emerged from the woods, it was as if nothing unusual had happened. That night, as I lay in bed, the events replayed in my mind. I couldn't explain what I had felt or heard, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The forest had its secrets, and I was content to let them remain undiscovered. All I knew was that I would return, perhaps not to that part of the woods, but to the forest itself. It was still my sanctuary, a place of peace and mystery, where the silent watchers would always be waiting. The forest had always been my retreat, a place to unwind and disconnect from the clamor of daily life. That day, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a soft golden light through the canopy. I felt an irresistible pull to wander deeper than I ever had before. I didn't bring a map. I didn't need one. Something about the woods always seemed to guide me, as though the trees themselves whispered directions in their gentle rustle. The trail started wide and familiar, bordered by tall ferns and sprinkled with soft pine needles. The sounds of the forest chirping birds and the occasional crack of a branch kept me company. But as I ventured farther, the path narrowed, the greenery thickened, and the air grew cooler. There was something different about this part of the forest, an old energy that hung in the air, not oppressive, but undeniably present. Then I saw them, stones. At first, just one or two moss-covered boulders, their surfaces dark and glistening from the recent rain. They stood out against the green of the undergrowth, their placement too deliberate to be random. Curious, I stepped closer, my boots crunching softly against the forest floor. As I pushed through a thicket of brambles, the full scene revealed itself. In the middle of a small clearing stood a circle of ancient stones, their surfaces blanketed in thick moss and creeping vines. The stones varied in size, some taller than me, others barely reaching my knees, but all were arranged in a perfect ring. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, almost humming with a strange energy. I paused at the edge of the clearing, my heart quickening. I don't know why, but I hesitated to step into the circle. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense of reverence, as though I had stumbled upon something sacred. The light in the clearing was peculiar to. Though the sun was setting, the space seemed to glow softly, the kind of light you'd expect in a dream. It felt otherworldly. I took a step forward, then another, drawn closer by an unshakable curiosity. As I entered the circle, a sudden hush fell over the forest. The birdsong stopped, and even the ever-present hum of insects seemed to fade. It was as though the world outside the clearing had paused, holding its breath. The air within the circle was cool, almost chilly, and carried a faint, earthy scent that reminded me of damp stone and old wood. I reached out to touch one of the stones. The moss felt soft and velvety under my fingers, but beneath it, the surface was smooth and cold. It was ancient, that much was certain. The weight of time seemed to radiate from it, as if it had witnessed countless seasons and secrets. That day, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a soft golden light through the canopy, I felt an irresistible pull to wander deeper than I ever had before. I didn't bring a map. I didn't need one. Something about the woods always seemed to guide me, as though the trees themselves whispered directions in their gentle rustle. It was soothing yet unfamiliar, like hearing a language you don't understand but somehow feel connected to. I turned slowly, scanning the circle for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, just the stones standing silent and still. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I didn't feel alone. If anything, I felt watched, though not in a threatening way. It was as though the stones themselves were aware of my presence, observing quietly, patiently. I knelt down, brushing away some moss from the base of one of the smaller stones. Beneath it, faint markings were etched into the surface symbols that looked like runes or glyphs, their meaning lost to time. As I traced the markings with my fingers, a wave of calm swept over me. The unease I had felt earlier melted away, replaced by a deep, inexplicable sense of peace. The energy of the circle, once mysterious and heavy, now felt comforting, like an embrace from an old friend. I don't know how long I stayed there, Time seemed to lose meaning within the circle, the minutes stretching into something intangible. Eventually, the fading light reminded me that I needed to head back before nightfall. As I stepped out of the circle, the forest seemed to exhale. The sounds of birds and insects returned, and the air felt lighter, less charged. Walking back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a gift and encounter with something ancient and profound. The stones, with their quiet presence, had shared a moment with me, a glimpse into a world beyond my understanding. I knew I would return someday, drawn back by the memory of that enchanted clearing and the calm it had brought to my soul. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the forest lingering in my thoughts. The whispering song, the vibrating earth, the ancient runes, they were mysteries I didn't need to solve. They were simply a reminder that the world still holds wonder, that even in the quietest corners of the forest, life brims with stories waiting to be discovered. And with that thought, I drifted into the most peaceful sleep I'd had in years. The forest was my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself and let the world's chaos fade away. That day, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced on the forest floor. It was the perfect time for a walk, quiet, still, and alive in its unique way. I had ventured onto a less traveled path, one I hadn't explored before. The trail wound between towering oaks and maples, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. The crunch of my boots on the dried leaves and twigs beneath me was the only sound accompanying my thoughts. It felt like I was the only soul in this vast expanse of green. But then I heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A faint sound barely audible over my own footsteps. It was distant, but unmistakably another set of steps, mirroring mine. When I paused, the sound stopped. I stood still, holding my breath, straining to hear more. Silence enveloped the forest again, so complete it was almost unnerving. I chuckled to myself, shaking off the sense of unease. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or perhaps even a squirrel scampering through the underbrush. I continued walking, trying to focus on the peacefulness of the woods. But a few steps later, the sound returned. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, like an echo of my own movement. This time, I turned quickly, scanning the trail behind me. There was nothing, just the same quiet path, lined with trees, whose branches intertwined to create a canopy above. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, giving the woods a darker, more mysterious feel. I tightened my grip on the walking stick I carried, more out of habit than need. As I walked on, the footsteps persisted, always faint and always behind me. The sound wasn't constant. It would start and stop, as if whoever or whatever was following me wanted to keep a certain distance. My heart began to race, the calm of my walk replaced by a growing sense of apprehension. I stopped again, turning slowly, scanning the forest. The trees stood tall and unyielding, their bark rough and uninviting. The undergrowth was thick in places, but there was no movement, no sign of another presence. The stillness felt unnatural now, as though the forest was holding its breath along with me. And with that thought, I drifted into the most peaceful sleep I'd had in years. The forest was my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself and let the world's chaos fade away. That day, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced on the forest floor. Deciding not to linger, I moved forward, this time heading toward a clearing I remembered passing earlier. The footsteps followed, growing fainter as I picked up my pace. My breathing was shallow now, each exhale visible in the cooling air. I focused on the trail ahead, the way the light filtered through the thinning canopy, leading me toward what I hoped was safety. When I reached the clearing, the sound stopped altogether. The footsteps, the rustling, they vanished, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The silence was profound, almost deafening. I stood there, catching my breath, the tension in my body slowly easing. The clearing was bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. The air felt lighter here, less oppressive. I turned in a slow circle, taking in the beauty of the place. Whatever had been following me seemed to have stayed behind, leaving me alone with the forest once more. As I made my way back to the main trail, the sense of unease began to lift. By the time I reached the familiar part of the path, the echoes of footsteps were a distant memory, replaced by the soothing sounds of the forest. The experience left me with a strange mix of emotions: fear, curiosity, and an odd sense of connection to the woods. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the footsteps. Who or what had been following me? The forest had its secrets, and I had merely glimpsed one of them. The mystery didn't frighten me anymore. Instead, it filled me with a sense of wonder. The woods, with their quiet whispers and unseen watchers, were alive in ways I couldn't fully understand. And that, I realized, was part of their magic. When I reached the clearing, the sound stopped altogether. The footsteps, the rustling, they vanished, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The silence was profound, almost deafening. I stood there catching my breath, the tension in my body slowly easing. The clearing was bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. The air felt lighter here, less oppressive. I turned in a slow circle, taking in the beauty of the place. There was a comforting predictability to the forest, a steady rhythm that always seemed to match my own. But as the path wound deeper, the air began to change. It started subtly, a chill creeping in where warmth had reigned just moments before. The sun, once shining boldly above the canopy, seemed to retreat, its light dimming as a strange mist began to gather. At first, it was just a thin veil hanging low over the ground, weaving between the roots and rocks. I barely noticed, distracted by the songs of distant birds and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. But the fog thickened. Within minutes, it was everywhere, an eerie blanket that wrapped itself around the trees, the trail, and me. My breath formed visible puffs in the air as I stood still, watching the forest transform. The mist had a way of dulling sound, muffling even the crunch of my footsteps. The bird song ceased entirely, leaving only an unsettling silence in its place. I could barely see a few feet ahead now. The trees that had felt like familiar companions turned ghostly and obscure. Their trunks, dark and gnarled, appeared to shift and sway in the fog's embrace. I hesitated, unsure whether to continue. Turning back seemed prudent, but a strange pull urged me forward. It was as if the mist itself were inviting me deeper, whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. My steps grew slower, more deliberate. I held my arms out slightly, brushing against unseen branches as I moved. The trail I had been following was gone, swallowed by the fog. Panic flickered at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it aside. There was no use in worrying, not yet. A soft rustle broke the silence, and I froze. It came from somewhere to my left, faint but distinct. My eyes darted to the source, but there was nothing there, just the thick, swirling mist. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was a deer or maybe the wind stirring the undergrowth. But then, a new sound joined the first. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like the forest itself was humming an ancient tune. I barely noticed, distracted by the songs of distant birds and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. But the fog thickened. Within minutes, it was everywhere. An eerie blanket that wrapped itself around the trees, the trail, and me. My breath formed visible puffs in the air as I stood still, watching the forest transform. The mist had a way of dulling sound, muffling even the crunch of my footsteps. The birdsong ceased entirely, leaving only an unsettling silence in its place. I could barely see a few feet ahead now. The trees that had felt like familiar companions turned ghostly and obscure. The day had started clear and bright, the kind of morning that beckoned for a long walk through the forest. I set out with a light heart and no particular destination, only a desire to lose myself among the towering trees and their soothing whispers. The air felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm. The mist swirled lazily around the stones, parting slightly as I stepped closer. Each stone seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, their markings glowing faintly in the dim light. As I stood there, staring at the circle, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by countless unseen presences. The forest was alive in a way I had never experienced before. The hum became almost melodic, filling the clearing with a sound that was both haunting and soothing. I knelt to touch one of the stones, its surface cool and slick with moss. The moment my fingers made contact, a shiver ran through me, not of cold, but of recognition. It was as if the stone carried memories, fragments of stories from long ago. I couldn't make sense of them, but the feeling was undeniable. The fog began to thicken again, creeping back into the clearing like a tide returning to shore. The hum softened, fading into the distance. The sense of being watched lessened, replaced by a strange peace. It was as if the forest had shown me something, allowed me a glimpse of its deeper mysteries, and now it was time to go. I stood and turned back the way I had come, though I wasn't entirely sure of the direction. The mist was denser now, and the path was still invisible, but my steps felt guided, as though the forest was gently nudging me towards safety. The air grew lighter as I walked, the oppressive stillness lifting. Finally, I emerged from the fog's embrace, back onto a familiar trail. The sun was visible again, its warm light chasing away the lingering chill. The birds had resumed their songs, and the forest felt ordinary once more. but I knew it wasn't. The memory of the stones and the hum stayed with me, a quiet reminder of the forest's secrets. That walk had been more than just a stroll through the woods. It had been an encounter with something timeless and profound. As I headed home, I felt a deep gratitude for the experience, strange and unsettling as it had been. That night, as I lay in bed, the image of the stones and the mist replayed in my mind. The forest had shared a piece of itself with me, a fragment of its ancient story. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a peace I hadn't known in a long time, as if the forest's hum still lingered, cradling me in its melody. The forest had always been a place of comfort, for me a retreat from the chaos of the world. On this particular day, the pull to venture deeper than ever before was irresistible. I set out with a bottle of water, a small pack on my shoulders, and a sense of curiosity that thrummed in my chest. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels sacred. The familiar trail wound beneath towering trees, their canopies swaying gently in the breeze. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the leaves, dappling the ground in a dance of light and shadow. I had walked this path many times, but today something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a quiet hum that seemed to beckon me forward. It wasn't long before I reached the end of the known trail, where most hikers would turn back, but my feet didn't stop. They led me onto a narrow, unmarked path that twisted through the undergrowth. The farther I walked, the denser the forest became. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, and their bark etched with patterns that looked like ancient runes. As I moved deeper into the woods, the air grew cooler and heavier, filled with the scent of earth and moss. The sound of birdsong faded until all I could hear was the rustle of leaves and the crunch of twigs beneath my boots. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then I saw it. The trees ahead parted to reveal a clearing, and at its center stood an enormous tree unlike any I had ever seen. Its trunk was impossibly wide, with roots that twisted and coiled around the earth like the veins of a giant. The bark was a deep, rich brown, glistening faintly as though it held some inner light. Its branches stretched high into the sky, their leaves forming a canopy so dense it seemed to hold the heavens themselves. I stopped in my tracks, awestruck. The tree exuded a presence, a gravity that pulled me closer. The sun was visible again, its warm light chasing away the lingering chill. The birds had resumed their songs, and the forest felt ordinary once more. But I knew it wasn't. The memory of the stones and the hum stayed with me, a quiet reminder of the forest's secrets. That walk had been more than just a stroll through the woods. It had been an encounter with something timeless and profound. As I headed home, I felt a deep gratitude for the experience, strange and unsettling as it had been. Images flickered in my mind, brief and fleeting. a glimpse of the forest as it had been centuries ago, untouched by human hands, animals moving freely under its canopy, and the slow, steady pulse of life that emanated from the earth. A soft sound drew my attention. It was faint at first, like a distant heartbeat, but it grew louder the longer I stood there. It wasn't coming from the tree, but seemed to be a part of it, a rhythm that resonated with my own. The sound was calming, almost hypnotic, and I felt myself sinking into a state of profound peace. But then the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cooler, and a shiver ran down my spine. The light in the clearing dimmed as clouds rolled in above, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The hum of the tree grew deeper, more resonant, as if it were responding to some unseen force. For a moment, fear prickled at the edges of my mind. I felt exposed, as though I were being watched. Turning slowly, I scanned the forest. The trees at the edge of the clearing loomed tall and dark, their branches forming twisted patterns against the gray sky. Yet there was no sign of movement, no rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs. It was just me and the ancient tree standing in the stillness. Steeling myself, I placed both hands on the trunk this time, grounding myself in its presence. The warmth returned, chasing away the chill. The heartbeat sound softened, becoming a gentle rhythm once more. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the energy of the tree flow through me. And then a voice not spoken but felt seemed to rise from the depths of my mind. It wasn't a language I recognized, but its meaning was clear. You are welcome here, but tread with care. This is sacred ground. A sense of awe and humility washed over me. I whispered a quiet thank you, unsure if the tree could hear or understand. The light in the clearing brightened slightly, and the tension in the air lifted. It felt as though the forest had accepted my presence, granted me permission to witness its heart. I stayed for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, sitting at the base of the tree and absorbing the serenity of the place. The world beyond the forest seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic pulse of life that the tree embodied. On this particular evening, I felt an unusual pull to go deeper than I ever had before, drawn by an unspoken curiosity. I packed a small bag, slipped on my boots, and left the familiar trail behind as the last hues of sunlight faded from the sky. The woods greeted me with their familiar embrace, the air cool and thick with the scent of pine and earth. At first, the walk was like countless others. By the time I emerged from the woods, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the ancient tree lingered in my mind. Its presence was a reminder of the deep, unspoken connection between all living things, a connection that was easy to forget in the rush of daily life. The hum of the forest still echoed in my ears, a soothing melody that carried me gently into sleep. And in my dreams, the tree stood tall, its branches reaching for the stars, its roots anchoring it firmly in the earth. It was the heart of the forest, eternal and unyielding, a guardian of secrets and a giver of peace. The forest had always been my refuge, a place to escape the world and let my thoughts untangle. On this particular evening, I felt an unusual pull to go deeper than I ever had before, drawn by an unspoken curiosity. I packed a small bag, slipped on my boots, and left the familiar trail behind as the last hues of sunlight faded from the sky. The woods greeted me with their familiar embrace, the air cool and thick with the scent of pine and earth. At first, the walk was like countless others. Birds fluttered in the distance, their songs a gentle backdrop, while the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at unseen creatures going about their routines. Yet, as the path narrowed and the shadows stretched longer, a strange hush settled over the forest. It was subtle at first. The bird songs grew softer, then ceased altogether, leaving only the faint rustling of the trees. I paused, taking in the stillness. It wasn't unsettling, not yet. In fact, it felt as though the forest was inviting me to listen more closely, to hear the quieter murmurs beneath its usual symphony. The trail led me to a clearing I didn't recognize, where the trees stood taller, their gnarled branches intertwining like the fingers of ancient hands. The light in the clearing brightened slightly, and the tension in the air lifted. It felt as though the forest had accepted my presence, granted me permission to witness its heart. I stayed for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, sitting at the base of the tree and absorbing the serenity of the place. The world beyond the forest seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic pulse of life that the tree embodied. I turned quickly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the shadows, shifting slightly as the breeze stirred the branches above. "Hello," my voice sounded strange in the stillness, too loud and yet swallowed almost immediately by the forest. There was no reply, only the whispering sound, now faintly coming from a different direction. My pulse quickened, but I reminded myself to stay calm. Perhaps it was just the wind, I thought, brushing through a patch of dry leaves. I continued forward, slower now, my senses heightened. The path wound deeper into the forest, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. They danced and shifted, moving in ways that didn't quite align with the sway of the trees. I stopped several times, convinced I had seen something out of the corner of my fleeting figure, a shape that melted back into the darkness before I could focus on it. The whispers grew more distinct as I walked, still faint but undeniably there. They weren't words exactly, but they carried an intent, a rhythm that felt deliberate. At times, it seemed they were following me, circling through the trees just out of sight. Other times, they felt ahead of me, guiding me deeper into the unknown. And yet, despite the unease prickling at the edges of my mind, I wasn't afraid, not entirely. There was a strange comfort in the whispers, as if they weren't meant to frighten but to communicate. I found myself whispering back, softly, words I didn't fully understand. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The shadows seemed to pause, the whispering halting for just a moment before resuming, softer now, almost soothing. Eventually, the trail opened into a small glade, where the shadows pooled thickest. In the center stood a large, weathered stone, its surface covered in moss and faint carvings that looked ancient, indecipherable. The air here felt different, denser, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I approached the stone slowly, feeling both drawn to it and wary of what I might find. The whispers grew louder as I neared, not chaotic, but layered, like 100 voices speaking in harmony. My heart pounded as I placed a hand on the stone. It was warm to the touch, a stark contrast to the cool air around me. The moment my skin made contact, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an almost deafening silence. And then, I felt it a presence. Not malevolent, not exactly, but powerful and ancient, as if the forest itself had turned its attention to me. Images flooded my mind in rapid flashes, trees growing and falling, animals moving through the undergrowth, seasons changing in an endless cycle. It was as if the forest was showing me its memories, its secrets, its soul. I pulled my hand back, breathing heavily. The shadows around the glade seemed to pulse faintly, as if acknowledging my presence. For a long moment, I stood there, unsure of what to do next. The forest felt alive in a way I had never experienced before, its energy humming all around me. Finally, the whispers returned, softer now, almost like a lullaby. They seemed to guide me back the way I had come, the shadows parting slightly to reveal the trail. I followed, feeling both humbled and deeply connected to the world around me. The fear I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. When I emerged from the forest, the stars were shining brightly overhead, their light casting a gentle glow on the path. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered, a quiet echo in my mind. As I walked back home, I couldn't help but feel as though I had been invited into a secret, a sacred part of the forest that few ever get to see. That night, as I lay in bed, the shadows in my room seemed softer, less threatening. The memory of the forest lulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that leaves you feeling whole and renewed. The whispers stayed with me, not as a haunting, but as a reminder of the connection we share with the world around unseen and unseen. The forest stretched before me like an invitation, its edges tinged with the golden light of late afternoon. I hadn't planned on taking a walk that day, but something about the way the breeze danced through the trees called to me. It wasn't just the promise of fresh air or solitude. It felt deeper, as if the forest had something to share. I stepped onto the narrow path, the soft crunch of my boots mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. The air was cool but comforting, carrying with it the faint, earthy scent of moss and damp wood. As I moved further in, the world outside seemed to fade away, replaced by a serene silence that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. The deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed to come alive, not with noise, but with a kind of quiet presence. The wind, threading its way through the towering trees, created a sound so soft it was almost imperceptible. At first it seemed random, just the natural shifting of air through branches. But as I listened, it began to form a rhythm, a melody that rose and fell like a gentle lullaby. I stopped walking, closing my eyes to better hear the sound. It was beautiful in its simplicity, soothing blend of sighs and whispers, as though the forest itself was singing. The melody carried a strange familiarity, like a song I'd known in a dream but couldn't quite place. It drew me in, calming my mind and easing the tension in my shoulders. I found a spot where the trees parted slightly, allowing a shaft of sunlight to filter through. It illuminated a patch of soft grass, inviting me to sit. I settled down, leaning against the sturdy trunk of an ancient oak. As I let myself relax, the wind's melody grew more distinct, each note weaving into the next with effortless grace. The forest seemed to breathe with me. My heartbeat slowed, matching the rhythm of the wind's song. There was something inviting about it, like it held a secret meant just for me. The path was uneven, winding its way through dense trees that seemed to close in as I went deeper. The air felt cooler here, tinged with the faint musk of moss and decaying leaves. My steps slowed as the forest grew quieter, the sounds of the main trail fading behind me. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. And then I saw it. Nestled in a small clearing, half hidden by tall grass and creeping ivy, was a rustic wooden bench. I opened my eyes and looked around, half expecting to see someone creating the sound. But the forest was as still as ever, the trees standing in quiet witness. A part of me felt foolish for expecting an explanation, but another part knew better. This wasn't something to be explained. It was something to be experienced. As I sat there, the melody seemed to tell a story, though not in words. It spoke of growth and decay, of seasons turning and life moving forward in an endless cycle. It was a song of balance, of peace, of the enduring strength found in stillness. I felt my worries, the nagging thoughts that had been with me all day, dissolve into the air, carried away by the wind's gentle tune. The temperature began to dip as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The wind's song softened, its melody slowing as though it, too, was preparing to rest. I felt a twinge of reluctance, not wanting the moment to end. But the forest seemed to reassure me, its energy wrapping around me like a final embrace. I stood, brushing off bits of grass and pine needles, and took one last deep breath. The air was cool and fresh, filling my lungs with a sense of renewal. As I made my way back to the path, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the remnants of its melody with it. It was a farewell and a promise, a reminder that this song was always there, waiting for me to listen. When I reached the edge of the forest, the world outside felt different, as though it had softened somehow. The noises of the evening distant traffic, a dog barking felt muted, less intrusive. The peace I had found in the forest stayed with me, a quiet hum in the background of my thoughts. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the faint echoes of the forest's lullaby. It played in my mind, weaving through my dreams, carrying me into a deep and restful sleep. The melody was a gift, a reminder of the tranquility that waits just beyond the noise of daily life, in a place where the wind sings and the trees listen. The forest had always been my refuge, a place where the weight of the world seemed to dissolve into the soft embrace of nature. That day was no different. I'd set out for a quiet walk after a long week, craving the kind of peace only the woods could provide. The late afternoon light slanted through the trees, casting golden patterns across the path. The air carried the earthy scent of damp soil and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. I walked slowly, letting my mind wander with the rhythm of my footsteps. The main trail was wide and well-trodden, familiar to me from countless visits. But something caught my attention, narrow path branching off to the right, barely visible through a cluster of ferns. It looked less traveled, almost forgotten. For a moment I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. There was something inviting about it, like it held a secret meant just for me. The path was uneven, winding its way through dense trees that seemed to close in as I went deeper. The air felt cooler here, tinged with the faint musk of moss and decaying leaves. My steps slowed as the forest grew quieter, the sounds of the main trail fading behind me. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting, and then I saw it. Nestled in a small clearing, half hidden by tall grass and creeping ivy, was a rustic wooden bench. It was simple in design, weathered by time and the elements, yet sturdy. The wood was darkened and cracked in places, but it exuded a charm that made it feel like it belonged, as though it had been there for centuries, quietly watching over the forest. I approached slowly, almost reverently, drawn to the bench as if by some invisible pull. It was positioned perfectly, facing a gentle slope that overlooked a cluster of wildflowers and a shallow brook that meandered through the clearing. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting a soft glow over the scene. It was breathtaking in its simplicity, a hidden oasis of tranquility. I sat down the bench, creaking softly under my weight. For a moment, I simply took it all in: the delicate hum of insects, the soft babble of the brook, the way the breeze danced through the leaves. It felt like the forest was alive, not just with sound but with a presence, a deep and ancient energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Closing my eyes, I leaned back and let myself relax. My mind, so often cluttered with thoughts and worries, began to quiet. The bench seemed to cradle me, its rough wood strangely comforting against my back. I could feel the history in it, as though it held the memories of all who had sat there before me. It was a place of stillness, of reflection. Time seemed to lose meaning. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but the light began to shift, deepening into the warm hues of early evening. A faint rustling in the underbrush caught my attention, and I opened my eyes to see a deer stepping cautiously into the clearing. It was a young doe, her movements graceful and deliberate. She paused, her dark eyes meeting mine, and for a moment we simply stared at each other. There was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity. It felt like a shared moment of understanding, a connection that transcended words. As the doe moved on, disappearing into the trees, I felt a sense of gratitude for this place, this moment, this quiet reminder of life's beauty. The bench, the clearing, the forest itself, they all seemed to whisper the same message: be still, be present. This is enough. The light continued to fade, the golden glow giving way to the soft blues and purples of twilight. Reluctantly, I stood, running my hand along the bench's worn surface one last time. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. As I made my way back to the main trail, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the bench to vanish, to dissolve back into the forest like a dream. But it remained steadfast and unchanging, waiting for the next weary soul to find its peace. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the bench and its quiet clearing stayed with me. It was more than just a piece of wood. It was a sanctuary, a reminder that even in the chaos of life, there are places of stillness if we're willing to seek them. The thought lulled me into a deep and restful sleep, the kind that leaves you feeling renewed and whole. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, the hidden bench remained, cradled by the trees, waiting to share its quiet magic with whoever might find it next. The late afternoon had always been my favorite time to visit the forest. The world seemed to slow down, and the golden light of the setting sun gave the trees an ethereal glow. That day, as I stepped onto the forest path, the air was cool and calm, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and pine. Each step I took felt like shedding a layer of stress, the weight of the week dissolving into the earth with every crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The forest was alive in a way that wasn't overwhelming. Birds chirped sporadically, their calls echoing faintly, and the breeze whispered through the trees, as if it carried secrets too sacred to say aloud. The tall pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently, casting playful patterns of shadow and light along the trail. As I walked, the sunlight began to shift, slanting lower through the trees. The golden beams seemed almost tangible, like ribbons unfurling between the trunks, wrapping the forest in a warm embrace. The colors were vivid, every leaf and blade of grass glowing, as though they held a light of their own. I paused for a moment, tilting my head back to watch the interplay of light and shadow above. The sight was breathtaking, a natural cathedral bathed in amber light. Continuing deeper into the woods, the air grew stiller, quieter. There was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity. It felt like a shared moment of understanding, a connection that transcended words. As the dome moved on, disappearing into the trees, I felt a sense of gratitude. For this place, this moment, this quiet reminder of life's beauty, the bench, the clearing, the forest itself, they all seemed to whisper the same message. Be still, be present. This is enough. The light continued to fade, the golden glow giving way to the soft blues and purples of twilight. I stopped at a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to reveal a patch of sky painted in hues of gold, orange, and pink. It was a breathtaking farewell to the day, the kind that made you feel as though time itself had slowed to let you take it in. I found a moss-covered log near the edge of the clearing and sat down, the cool, soft texture beneath me grounding me to the moment. The sun's rays poured through the trees in long golden shafts, illuminating floating specks of dust that danced like tiny fireflies. The air had a hushed reverence about it, as though the forest too was holding its breath, watching the sun's descent. Closing my eyes, I let the warmth of the last rays wash over my face. It felt like an embrace, a gentle reminder of life's fleeting beauty. A distant bird let out a plaintive call, and I opened my eyes to see its silhouette perched on a high branch, framed against the fiery backdrop of the sky. The sight stirred something deep within me, a blend of gratitude and melancholy. There's something about the end of the day that makes you reflective, even wistful. The forest seemed to mirror my thoughts, its shadows lengthening as the light dimmed, whispering of cycles and endings. I thought about how the sun would set. It would sleep under the stars. As the sun sank lower, casting its final golden beams, the clearing was bathed in a warm, almost otherworldly glow. The trees seemed to lean in, their long shadows reaching toward me like they too wanted to hold on to the light a little longer. The moment was bittersweet, the kind of beauty that left a soft ache in your chest, a longing to capture it, to keep it forever. But nature isn't meant to be held, it's meant to be experienced, to remind us of the ebb and flow of life. Sitting there, watching the last sliver of sunlight disappear behind the treetops, I felt a deep sense of peace. The forest had given me a gift, a quiet moment of connection with something greater than myself. When the light was finally gone, the woods transformed. The golden hues gave way to cool blues and grays, and the shadows grew thicker, more mysterious. The sounds of the forest shifted. Two crickets began their nightly song, and the soft rustle of nocturnal creatures waking up replaced the earlier chorus of birds. Yet, even in the growing darkness, the forest didn't feel threatening. It felt alive, pulsing with a quiet energy that was both calming and humbling. Reluctantly, I stood and made my way back to the trail, the faint glow of twilight guiding my steps. I walked slowly, not wanting to leave, but knowing the memory of this evening would stay with me long after I'd left the forest behind. The last rays of sunlight had gone, but their warmth lingered, a quiet echo in my heart. By the time I emerged from the woods, the first stars had begun to appear in the sky. I turned back once, looking at the darkened canopy of trees silhouetted against the twilight. The forest had given me a moment of stillness, a reminder of the beauty in endings, and the promise of new beginnings with the coming dawn. It was evening by the time I stepped out of the forest. The trail had led me back to the small gravel road that marked its boundary, but something had shifted in me. The air was crisp and cool, tinged with the faint scent of pine and earth, yet it felt heavier now, almost sacred. I stood there for a moment, turning back to face the towering trees behind me. Their shadows stretched long and dark across the ground, illuminated faintly by the glow of the setting sun. I expected to feel a sense of relief, of returning to open ground, but instead, there was a peculiar ache in my chest, like I was leaving something important behind. The silence of the forest clung to me, wrapping around my shoulders like an invisible cloak. It wasn't an absence of sound. There were faint chirps of crickets and the distant rustling of leaves, but it was a deeper kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from stillness but from understanding. I glanced down the road, its gravel crunching softly beneath my boots as I started walking. The rhythmic sound of my footsteps felt louder than it should have, almost intrusive. My mind was still lost in the embrace of the woods, replaying fragments of the evening like a dream I didn't want to wake from. The way the sunlight had filtered through the trees, the soft hum of the breeze, the gentle rustle of unseen creatures, it all lingered, vivid and alive, even though I had left it behind. A part of me half expected to hear something more, perhaps a faint echo of my name, or the whisper of leaves bending under an unseen touch. There had been moments in the forest that felt so intimate, so unearthly, as though I wasn't alone. That feeling lingered now, not as fear, but as a strange kind of solace. I felt watched, but not in a way that unnerved me. It was as if the forest itself had taken notice, acknowledging my presence before letting me go. The road curved gently ahead, and as I walked, the memory of the forest began to intertwine with the present moment. The trees seemed to follow me in my thoughts, their shadows etched into my memory. I could almost feel the cool bark under my fingers, the texture rough but grounding. They stood tall and steadfast, a reminder of the journey I'd taken. It felt as though the forest had given me something intangible, but deeply profound. Sitting at the table, I cradled the warm cup in my hands and let my thoughts wander. The forest had shown me its secrets, not in grand gestures, but in the quietest of moments. The way the sunlight danced through the canopy, the gentle rustling of leaves, the whispered songs of unseen birds. It had taught me to listen, not just to the world, but to myself. The faint glow of twilight painted the world in soft hues, but it couldn't match the golden light of the forest. That light, warm and alive, had felt like a promise, a connection to something ancient and unspoken. And though I had left it behind, it stayed with me, a quiet warmth in my chest. I stopped walking for a moment, drawn by the stillness of the scene around me. The road was empty, bordered by wildflowers and tall grass, swaying gently in the breeze. In the distance, a small farmhouse stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its windows glowing faintly with the promise of home. Yet, I hesitated. The forest was behind me now, but its silence remained, as if the trees had whispered a truth too profound to forget. I sat down on a flat stone by the roadside, letting the night settle around me. The sounds of the world were gentle. A far-off owl hooted, its call echoing faintly, and the wind carried with it the faint rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of the stream I had passed earlier. Yet it wasn't empty. It was full of presence, of life moving in rhythms too subtle to hear. I closed my eyes, letting the feeling wash over me. The weight of the day slipped away, replaced by a profound stillness. My breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the world around me. The forest had given me a gift, one I hadn't realized I needed. It had quieted the noise inside me, replacing it with something far more powerful, low, deep, unshakable calm. As I sat there, a memory surfaced, unbidden but welcome. It was the moment I had paused in a sunlit clearing where the light had danced between the leaves, painting the ground in shifting patterns. I had felt a presence then, a connection that defied words. That feeling was with me now, lingering like a soft echo, a reminder of the peace I had found in the heart of the woods. Eventually, I rose and continued my walk, my steps slower, more deliberate. The farmhouse grew closer, its warm light beckoning, but I felt no rush to reach it. The silence of the forest stayed with me, a gentle reminder of the evening's journey. It wasn't just a memory, it was a part of me now, a quiet strength that I could carry forward. When I finally reached the farmhouse and stepped inside, the warmth of the hearth greeted me, its crackling fire a comforting sound. Yet, even amidst the coziness of home, the forest lingered. Its stillness wrapped around me, a quiet embrace that softened the edges of the world. As I prepared for bed, the memory of the walk played in my mind like a lullaby, its rhythm slow and steady. Lying under the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the window, I closed my eyes. The silence of the forest was with me, its calmness a steady presence. And as I drifted into sleep, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the forest, for its whispers, and for the peace it had left behind. The next morning, as the soft light of dawn spilled into the room, I woke with a peculiar sense of stillness. It wasn't just the quiet of the house or the faint hum of the wind outside. It was a silence within me, a peace that seemed to flow through my veins. The memory of the forest was as vivid as if I had just stepped out of it. I could still feel the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the cool touch of the breeze on my skin, and the inexplicable calm that had settled over my spirit. I went about my morning slowly, savoring the simplicity of routine. Boiling water for tea, I I found myself gazing out the window at the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. They stood tall and steadfast. It felt as though the forest had given me something intangible but deeply profound. Sitting at the table, I cradled the warm cup in my hands and let my thoughts wander. The forest had shown me its secrets, not in grand gestures, but in the quietest of moments. The way the sunlight danced through the canopy, the gentle rustling of leaves, the whispered songs of unseen birds. It had taught me to listen, not just to the world, but to myself. And as I sat there, the world around me hushed in the embrace of night, I knew the forest's peace would stay with me always. It had become a gentle reflection of the calm I sought, a reminder that even amidst the chaos of life, there is always a place of stillness within. With that thought, I rose and stepped inside, the soft glow of the hearth greeting me like an old friend. Climbing into bed, I felt the weight of the day melt away, replaced by the serene memories of my walk through the forest. The quiet lingered as I closed my eyes, a soothing melody that lulled me to sleep, carrying me into dreams as peaceful as the forest itself.